Yom and Base 5b, and the one we learned yesterday was actually a Gemara we started the day before, and it had to do with the calculation of how big the ark was. And the ark had really a few parts to it. It had the three boxes on the bottom, and it had this board that covered the ark. And inside the ark, we know it had the tablets, and the ark itself. So it had these three boxes. It had a wood box, and then it had an outer box and an inner box, which was gold, solid gold. And then on top, it had a solid piece, a thick piece of gold, which was like a board as a cover. It's called the kapiras. And that cover, so the Gemara is calculating the size of it, because the Chumash doesn't tell us the exact size of its thickness. It says we know how big the ark was, and we know how big, how wide it was, and how the length of it. We don't know the height of the kapiras. The ark, we know the height. The height of the ark was 1 amma and a half. And an amma, the Gemara understands, was 6 handbreadths. So the cubit is 6 handbreadths. So if it's an amma and a half, it's 9 handbreadths. And the question was, what about that extra cover, the kapiras? How thick of a bar of gold was it? It was a solid gold, and how thick was it? It's quite. We know the width and the length. It's the same size as the ark, because it covered the ark, so it was the same size. It was the 2.5 amas by 1.5 amas. That was the width and the length. But the question was, what about the height? So the Gemara went through a whole bunch of series of calculations. In other words, how are we going to learn the height? So the Gemara says, well, we could learn it from the smallest of the vessels, and that would be the miskeres, which was a border around the table that had the breads, the showbreads. And we know that border was a tefach, because the pasuk, the verse itself says the word tefach or teifach. So we know that was a tefach, and that's why. So we'll learn from there that this also was a tefach. In other words, the fact that it doesn't say the amount, it basically is telling us it was the same amount as the smallest vessel. But the Gemara said, but there are other vessels. Maybe learn from a big vessel, a different vessel. The Gemara says, no, you can't assume that it's bigger. Otherwise, it would have had to tell us that it's assume it's the smallest amount, and that's the size of the kapiras. So it would be a handbreadth. So if the ark was 9 handbreadths and the cover of it was 1 handbreadth, ultimately it equals 10 handbreadths, and that will prove what we're trying to prove here. What are we trying to prove? What's the ultimate goal of this whole discussion? Is the fact that Hashem shined his divine presence above the 10 handbreadths, and that Hashem doesn't lower himself below the 10 handbreadth mark, and that will tell us that there's a domain called 10 handbreadth domain, and that's like a size of a domain. And if that's the size of a domain, that would be a size of a kosher sukkah, and anything less than that would not be a kosher sukkah. So in other words, we're ultimately proving about a law regarding the sukkah that has to be a 10 handbreadth domain, and we're proving it because the divine presence doesn't go below its domain, and there's a domain that it's above the kapiras, the cover to the ark. That's where the divine presence is, and below that it doesn't go. It means that's a domain. So how high is the kapiras? So here we're proving that it must be, if it's the ark is 9 tefachs, 9 handbreadths, and the kapiras is 1 handbreadth, that would be 10 handbreadths. That would prove our point. The Gemara says, well, why don't we learn from the tzitz? Because the tzitz, we know, is a little smaller than a tefach, a handbreadth. And the term the Gemara uses is, it is 2 etzba'os, 2 finger breadths. And the Gemara says, well, first the Gemara asks what we should learn from a big vessel, and the Gemara says you can't assume it's bigger. Now, what about the tzitz? It's actually smaller. So Gemara says that the tzitz is considered a tachshit, like a decoration or a jewelry, and you can't assume that you can't learn the law of a vessel of the cover to the ark from a tachshit. some type of a malbush. Rashi says tachshit is a malbush. It's like a clothing. So you can't learn the size of the kaperes from clothing. So the Gemara says, what about learn from that? So that's the tzitz. The tzitz was the headband. So the Gemara says, well, then learn from the zer. And the zer was only a mashu, it was only a tiny size. The zer was a little decoration above the table. And the Gemara says that the reason you don't learn from the zer is because the zer is more of an accessory and a ornamental accessory to the vessel, but rather we're going to learn from the meskeres, which is not that way. The Gemara says, "What do you mean? The meskeres is also a sort of like a decoration to the table. It makes it beautifies the table." The Gemara answers that really the meskeres was below. It's not above as a decoration. It's really below as an integral part of the table. And the Gemara says, but that's about machlokes. There's an argument about it. So the Gemara says that, you know what, it's a whole different reason. We're going to learn from the meskeres because the meskeres is something that the Torah gives a measure for, instead of learning from the tzitz and the zer, which we don't really have a clear measure for in the Torah. The measure for the tzitz is either rabbinic or in other words, the actual amount, it doesn't say clearly how big it is. And even though we said it's two finger breadths, but that's not written in the Torah. So the Gemara says we're going to learn instead from the meskeres, because that it does say how big it was, and that we know. And therefore, we'll learn from that the size of the kaperes was the same size as the meskeres. It's a tefach. And ultimately, we have an answer to your question. Yes, David.
Yeah, how do we figure out that the Shekhinah is above the 10 handbreadths, and at the same time we say that where there's 10 Jews that are together learning, the Shekhinah comes down.
Right. So this boils down to the same question that we've been dealing with. You have to understand this is it's called a Agadata Gemara. This is a Gemara that has secrets hidden in it, and that question that you're asking, it's like an additional question to the other questions that we've been struggling with, which is Hashem is everywhere, right? And we have other sources that the Shechina, the Shechina is Beineihem, is with that. There are many other sources as well that there's Shechina in down here on earth. And the one of the big questions we said was the Medrash that talks about the fact that Hashem did come down to this world after Matan Torah, which the Gemara here says for very clearly not. So this is a Gemara that deserves more of an understanding based on the mystical dimension of it. And the way we tried to explain it was based on what I saw here was the Michtav Meliyahu. They bring it down. But now I saw that the Maritz Chayes also says a similar idea about Bechira, that this Gemara is referring to the concept of Bechira, this is an understanding of a way of understanding this Gemara, that it has to do with Hashem's presence, which doesn't mean that Hashem's presence isn't here always. Hashem's presence is everywhere, but the ability of Hashem's presence to be revealed to the extent that it would remove a person's free choice, that's what our Gemara is saying, that Hashem's presence is not to that extent. It's not removing your free choice. So that would seemingly be the understanding. So is the divine presence, your question was, does the divine, what says the divine presence is if there's 10 men, there's divine, yeah. That divine presence is not a divine presence that doesn't allow you to have free choice. Our Gemara is talking about the divine presence, the level or revelation of it that removes your ability to have free choice, and that that type of divine presence, meaning that revelation of divine presence, is not what the Gemara is talking about when you have 10 Jews. 10 Jews is a divine presence, but it's not felt to that extent that it would remove someone's free choice. Yes, that's the way we explained it. Okay, so anyway, I'm sure there's other interpretations. I mean, I looked over here, I didn't see much here in the Svarim that I have, but I believe there must be something, at least in Hasidic writings about this. But at the moment, I'm not aware of those insights. Okay, so anyway, the Gemara that we've been learning. So we just concluded one of the understandings of how the kapiras was a tefach. So we basically learned it from the misgeras. Rav Huna said that we learn it from the pasuk that says pnei hakapiras, the face of the kapiras. So on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would sprinkle the blood towards the kapiras, and this was when he would sprinkle it 8 times, 1 plus 7, and he would face so it says to the face of the kapiras. So if the kapiras had a face, that means that it's the size of a face. He uses the word face. And what is the size of a face? At least a small face, a small human face. Of course, everyone has a different size face, but a small human face is minimally, it's a tefach, it's a handbreadth. So this would be another source from the pasuk saying Pnei. It teaches us that it must be a handbreadth. So the first source was we learned from the smallest vessel that it doesn't say the size here, but the smallest vessel is a handbreadth of this. Here now Gemara is learning that the Rav Huna has another shot that it says the word in the verse. It says Pnei. So from that word Pnei, we're going to learn that it means a handbreadth. And of course, the Gemara has questions on that because the Gemara says, "What do you mean? There's other face. Some faces are big. Like there's a bird that's called the bar yuchni, which was a huge bird. Rashi says something that sounds beyond belief, like that this bird, one dropped an egg and it sort of destroyed 300 cedar trees. And I mean, this is a huge bird. It's like maybe what they would say dinosaurs or whatever, this bird, it drowned 60 shishim krachim, 60 big cities. So anyway, there was basically, it could be it's an exaggeration. Sometimes the Gemara uses doesn't mean it literally, but whatever it is, it's basically a big bird. So anyway, it obviously had a big face. If if it could make an egg so big, it must be a huge bird. The Gemara says so. So the Gemara, of course, answers tafasta meruba like tafasta. If you grab too much, you're not going to get anything. You have to ask for something reasonable. And here also, if you're gonna, if the pasuk says it was like a face, you can't assume it was the largest face. You have to assume that it's the smallest face. So the Gemara says, what about there are birds that have smaller faces than a handbreadth? So the Gemara answers that we learn a gzeira shava pnei pnei, which means that Rav Huna said you learn from the fact that it says face. The Gemara is explaining what did Rav Huna really mean. Rav Huna said you learn from the fact that it says face, but then it could be the face of a bird, it could be the face of a, it's the face of a human. We don't know. So the Gemara explained, no, Rav Huna meant that pnei, you learn it from the fact that it says face, that the kapiras had a face. It has to be a handbreadth because there's a gzeira shava, there's a word that it says pnei by a human, and it says pnei by the kapiras. So we see that it's we compare it to a human face. We say it must be the size of a small human face, and that is a tefach. And the Gemara gives a verse of pnei by a human, by Yitzchok. It says pnei Yitzchok of it. So the Gemara says, well, but there's other pneis. There's a pnei called pnei elikim, right? It says the face of an angel. So Maybe it means the size of a face of an angel, which seemingly could be very big. According to one commentary, he says it means it's unlimited. Maybe the Kapiris went all the way to the ceiling of the Holy of Holies. You know, the Ark was in the Holy of Holies, so maybe it went all the way to the ceiling. You know, it was there was no limit, so to speak. So the Gemara says, yeah, you could learn from there, but the thing is, you can't if you tafasta meruba like tafasta. If you ask for too much, you get nothing. But if you try to grab too much and you try to and you want to say it means that, not necessarily is that correct. But if you say the minimal amount, then it's for sure correct. The minimal amount is that it's a face, so it says Pnei, we'll say a human, not an angel. But the Gemara now asks more questions, and that's where we got up to. So we're on 5b, and we're explaining the source of Rav Huna, who learned from the fact that it says a face of a kapiris, that it means a face minimally is a handbreadth. How does he really know that? And how does he know that a face, and which face is he comparing it to? Now, I should just give a little point, add a little point over here, and that is that there is a concept of a gzeira shava that we're using here. It's called the gzeira shava means that there's a word that is mentioned twice. In one place is going to be more clear than the other one. And we'll say because the Torah uses that same word, it's telling us that we're supposed to learn from the place that it says that says clearly something that applies to the other place as well, where it doesn't say it clearly. So in our scenario, what this refers to is kapiris. It doesn't say how large it was, but because it uses the word pnei here and it has the word pnei somewhere else, so the Gemara, the understanding is that Hashem wanted us to compare the two and say, if it says pnei there and it means this and this size, here also it means this size. That's gzeira shava. Now, gzeira shava, you can't just make your own gzeira shavas, because if I find the word in the Torah that says a certain thing, I can't just say, well, it says over there also that must be the same. It must be, we compare the two. You can't make your own. A gzeira shava is only something that is that you have a tradition. I have a tradition that was from Sinai, that gzeira shava, that there's a connection between this word pnei and it's supposed to be learned from a gzeira shava. Now, if that's so, that I have to learn, that I have a tradition about pnei, and if you don't have a tradition, you can't just make up some lesson and expound because it says the word here and it says the word somewhere else. You can't say, oh, that means it's showing that this also would have the same laws. You can't just do that. The problem is that what is our Gemara doing? Our Gemara says, Ravacha Bar Yaakov explained that there's a gzeira shava pnei for kapiris and pnei to Yitzchok Aviv. The Gemara says, but who says? Maybe there's another pnei in the Torah. Pnei elikim batertzeni. So you could ask a question on this whole rule that a gzeira shava has to be taught from your teacher, a tradition all the way back to Moses at Sinai. How can you ask such a question? So it says pnei somewhere else, but we don't have a tradition on that pnei. This is where we have a tradition. So this is the pnei that obviously is meant to be learned from, because this is where the tradition is. So what does the Gemara mean to ask this question? But we have a word pnei somewhere else. That doesn't prove us wrong. Our tradition is the word pnei over here, and we have this tradition that this is what Hashem wanted. So how could you ask such a question when it comes to gzeira shava? If we were just learning some kal v'chomer, some other way of expounding, then you could say, oh, well, why are you using this to make to teach something? You could learn it from some other law. But if you're using the method, the mechanism of Gzeira Shava, it has to be you have to have it as a part of your tradition. You can't just make up some Gzeira Shava. So what does our Gemara mean where we have a word Pnei that we know where we're supposed to learn it from, and you're going to ask a question, well, it says Pnei somewhere else. That's not a question. Any thoughts on this? So the understanding is that when you have a Gzeira Shava, well, you have a tradition that the word Pnei is going to be learned from a Gzeira Shava. That is true. But not always is the Gzeira Shava very clear. Where are you supposed to learn it from? In other words, we know that the word Pnei, when it says by the Kapeiras, we have a tradition that this is part of a expounding on the word Pnei from some other place. But not necessarily do we have the tradition of where that other place is. So the expounding that the word Pnei is going to be learned from somewhere else, that we have a tradition on. But we don't necessarily have the tradition of where it's supposed to be learned from. And that you have to figure out where is the other location where we're going to get it from. And so we know that Pnei is going to be teaching us something from some other Pnei, but if there's a few times where it says Pnei, then we got to have, that's what the Gemara is asking. How do you know to learn it from this one? Maybe learn it from a different Pnei, because not always is the Gzeira Shava so clear of where it's supposed to be learned from. In other words, you don't always have the tradition of which location is the original source to compare it to. So that's what our Gemara is dealing with now. I'm going to start from Amar Ravacha Bar Yaakov. Amar Ravacha Bar Yaakov is maybe 10 lines from the top of the page. 5b. If you do have the art scroll, it is 5b1 on the second column, the first new paragraph. Amar Ravacha Bar Yaakov Gemiri. We have a tradition. No, 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm before that. I'm sorry. We're gonna start a little earlier than that. Yes. What did you want to say?
We didn't discuss the Keruvim yesterday, so you're before that for sure.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I just realized there's two Ravacha Bar Yaakovs. In other words, it says we're going to start the third line from the top. The third line from the top of the page, 5b1 in the art scroll, on the first column, the third paragraph. Thank you for correcting me, Ezra. Okay, so we're starting from Amar Rav Yaakov Bar Yaakov, the third line, page 5, the third line on page 5b. So Rav Yaakov Bar Yaakov says that Rav Huna Pnei Gama. Rav Huna learned the Gzeira Shava Pnei. That it says here Pnei and it says somewhere else Pnei, and we're going to learn that it means a handbreadth. And that's going to teach us that the Kapeiros is really a handbreadth. Ksiv Hacha El Pnei Kapeiros. It says over here that the Kapeiros, that he threw he sprinkled the blood to the face of, towards the face of the Kapeiros, El Pnei Kapeiros. Uksiv Hasam, and it says over there, Me'ez Pnei Yitzchok Aviv, that when Yaakov left from before his father's face, so it uses the word face over there. So that teaches us that when it says the word Pnei, it means the size of a human face. And this answers the question that we had before, that maybe we should consider the size of the Kapeiros to be the size of a bird's face, maybe a small bird. The Gemara's answer is that no, we have Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says that Rav Huna learned a Gzeira Shava that we're going to compare the word Pnei here to a word Pnei somewhere else, and obviously it means that there's a tradition that this word Pnei is supposed to be learned from somewhere. We're learning it from the Pnei where it says Pnei Yitzchok Aviv, that it's the face of a human, and therefore the size would be a handbreadth. Now the Gemara says, but there are other words Pnei in the Torah. B'neilaf mipanim shel Milo d'chsiv kirois Pnei Elokim v'tertzeni. That it says the face. It uses the word for face of above, so to speak, which we're in this scenario we're referring to angels, where it says Yaakov told Esav that take my gift because it would be an honor because an honor for me to have that you take my gift, because it's like receiving the face of an angel and being appeased. In other words, by you accepting my gift, it's like when I saw the angel and it appeased him. Now, so you see the word face by an angel. So the Gemara answers that no, we're not going to learn Pnei Pnei from an angel. Instead, we're going to learn Pnei Pnei from a human. Why? Why do we use Gzeira? How do we know to learn the Gzeira Shava? Again, we only know half of this Gzeira Shava, with that the word Pnei by the Kapiras has to do with Gzeira Shava. That we're supposed to learn it from Gzeira Shava, but we don't know what the original source of that is. And the Gemara thought maybe you could learn it from a face of an angel. The Gemara answers, so like it's answered a few times already. Tafasta meruba like tafasta. When you try to take too much, you don't get anything. Tafasta mua tafasta. If you try to take a little, then what you took is good. And what that means in this scenario is when you're trying to expound something, you can't assume that it's teaching you something that's the biggest possible lesson. You have to assume the smallest assumption. Now, you have to learn something from it, but you can't learn something that's not necessarily so. But you could learn the smallest thing that would be correct. So, in other words, you could learn that it means the face of a human, not the face of an angel.
Rabbi, question.
Yes.
You said that this is when Yaakov met Esav.
Yeah.
Could that mean I saw your angel and he tried to conquer me? Meaning he's saying to Esav, your heavenly angel attempted on my life, and but he didn't succeed.
Well, Vatirtzeni is and I think the first half of what you said is the simple understanding, but Vatirtzeni is and he was appeased. Kirais Pnei Elikim, like seeing the face of your angel, which is, in other words, that I saw, and Vatirtzeni, and he was appeased. So in other words, please accept my gift, because it's like when I saw your angel was appeased and forgave me.
Yeah, but you can also from the verb rotze.
Yeah.
He wanted.
Oh, he wanted to kill me.
Ani. Tirtze rotze ani.
Uh-huh.
He
Yeah.
wanted me.
Uh-huh.
He wanted to conquer me. He wanted
Right.
to
Right. Yeah, it sounds good. I don't know if any of the commentaries say that shot. That's a nice shot. In other words, the fact that I'm here means that I won him, that he didn't succeed because I'm here. That's what you're saying. In other words, he doesn't have to say that he didn't succeed, because the fact that he's there shows he didn't succeed. But yeah, it's a nice shot. It's not the simple. It's not Rashi. Rashi doesn't seem to understand it that way. But maybe
why would he say it? He was appeased because the angel lost, and the only reason why the angel was even allowed to get away is because Yaakov gave him permission to leave. So it couldn't have been that he was appeased.
Well, the fact that he was forced to accept, to forgive, so to speak. He was forced to forgive him for the brachas and acknowledge the brachas. So maybe you wouldn't use the actual word appeased, but he gave in. He gave in. Basically, Yaakov is trying to
I know he's saying
scare.
all these nice words to his brother in order to make him, feel like he's somebody. Okay.
Well, two things. One is he's scaring him, like, oh, I see angels. Do you want to? He might not want to start with me. I'm familiar not only with angels. I happen to know your angel above, and I actually, had a, he actually forgave me. So it's not worth for you to fight with me. But also, like, I know angels. Like, you might not want to mess. All along those lines, like, So number one, he forgave me. Number two, I see angels. It seems like there's a few points here. But anyway, I mean, our Gemara doesn't really have, we don't have to really translate it so much. It's the main, that's really when you learn Chumash. But I like your pshat. It's a nice pshat. I don't know if anyone says it. Because in other words, it's the same point that I saw your angel and he didn't even win. And, you might not want to start with me because I even won your angel. I'm going to win you for sure. That's what you want to say, right? That I won your angel. Don't even think you're gonna have any.
Yeah, no. My problem was the word appeased. It didn't
I
come
see.
from Vatiatzeni. It just doesn't come. I mean, maybe it's the modern Hebrew, whatever, but it
Right.
didn't fit the way I understood. But that's me. All right, forget it.
Right. No, I hear what you're saying. It seems like you agreed, Vatiatzeni, you agreed to forgive me, and the angel agreed. Maybe along those lines, Maratza. But anyway, that's the way Rashi seems to explain it. Okay, so we're getting back to our Gemara. So we have the word pnei when it talks about an angel, and the Gemara says that tafasta meruba like tafasta. You can't assume that the size of the kapiras was the size of the face of an angel. Now, the Gemara says that v'nelaf mikruv. Well, if we're learning from the word face in the pasuk in the verse, and we have to find another place in another verse where it says face, and then we're going to compare the two faces and say whatever the size of face it says it means over there is going to be the same size here for the compares. So Gemara says, what about this other place? It says face of a kruv, and it says v'nelaf mikruv. We should learn from a kruv, as it says, Ela kaperes yupnei kruvim. Towards the kaperes should the faces of the kruvim face towards. In other words, and it means that the faces of the kruvim were above the kaperes. And that's where the kruvim were located. Of course, they were banged out from that gold, and they were right on top of the kapiras, and they faced the pnei hakruvim, the kapiras. They faced the kapiras. So the Gemara says that the kruvim, these cherubs, it says the word face for the cherubs, and the Gemara assumes that probably the cherub's face was small, and therefore maybe they weren't the size of a tefach. Maybe they were less than that. So the Gemara answers that Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Gemiri, we have a teaching, we have a tradition, Gemiri, we have a tradition. Ein pnei kruvim pchusin mitefach, that the cherub's face was the size of a tefach, actually. So it actually fits. Even if you want to learn from there, you would have the same lesson that it's the size of a tefach, and it's the same as the size of a human. Rav Huna nami mehacha gomer, and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says that in truth he probably learned from the the Gzeira Shava was probably from the Kruvim, from the cherubs, and not from the other source, that it's not from the other source that we learned before, that it's from Yitzchok, not that it was the face of Yitzchok. Now, why does the Gemara prefer learning it from the face of the cherubs instead of the face of Yitzchok? Because this is exactly where it's being made. It's created. The kapiris was banged out from the mina kapiris yupnei kruvim, right? Well, ella kapiris yupnei kruvim. The cherubs were right. This is part of the same portion where it talks about the kapiris. It talks right about the cherubs, which are right on top of it. So in Parshas Truma, where it talks about building the ark, forming the ark, so it says, you should make 2 kruvim of zahav, 2 cherubs of gold, banged out. You should make mishnei ketzais hakapiras, from the 2 ends of the cover. And that's in verse Yudches 18. And the understanding is that they banged it out from a very large piece of gold, and they weren't attached to the kapiras by creating them and then attaching them, but rather they were actually banged out from a very large piece of gold that had a board on the bottom, and they banged out these cherubs on top. So the Gemara says the face of the board on the bottom is learned from the face of the cherubs that were right on top of it. It would make sense to learn it one from the other. So that's the Gemara's understanding, and that's so. Now the Gemara says that umay kruv. Once we're talking about the concept of the cherubs, the Gemara says, and what is what does it mean, the word kruv, or what's the form of this kruv, of this cherub? So Amar Rabbi Avahu kiravya. It's like a child, baby. That's what kruv means, kiravya. In other words, the word kruv is from the word ravya, which means a child. Shekain bebavel, currently Yanuka ravya. They would call a child by the term ravya. So that's what the word cherub means, that it looked like a child. So the child's head, basically. Amar le Abaye. So Abaye says, Ela meyato. If that is so, dichsiv, that it says pnei ha'echad pnei ha'kruv, that it says by the cherubs, of the chariot of Ezekiel, it says that there were 4 faces to each cherub, and it says Pnei ha'echad. The face of one was Pnei ha'kruv, was the face of a kruv, a child. Pnei ha'sheni, the face of the other direction, or the other face, was a Pnei Adam, the face of a person. And there was a third one and a fourth one, the face of a lion and the face of a eagle, Nesher, like Pnei Aryeh, Pnei Nesher. So anyway, the point is that if you say that the kruv is a human, so seemingly that would be the same. Kruv and a Adam is the same thing. So how could in the chariot of Ezekiel that Ezekiel saw, how could it say over there that the face of the one side was kruv, and the other side was human. I thought kruv is also human, is also a human. My answer is yeah. One of them is an adult, one of them is a child. So the Gemara asks, Hainu kruv, hainu adam. It's the same thing. Kruv and adam, right? The kruv is a person, and adam is a person. My answer is api ravri. This is an adult, a face of a big face, and va'api zutra in a small face, a child. So that's the Gemara's answer to what does it mean? The kruv is a child. So anyway, bottom line is that we've now come to the conclusion that the source of a sukkah has to be 10 handbreadths. And because the ark was 10 handbreadths, if you include the kapiras, and which means 9 for the ark and 1 for the kapiras, for the cover, and Hashem doesn't allow his Shechina to rest below the kapiras, below this cover. That means that that's a domain of its own right. And if that's a domain in its own right, that would mean that the sukkah would be 10 tfachim minimal height. That would be a size of a domain. So the Gemara now says.
So Rabbi,
yes.
the chaf of the kruv is meaning like.
Right. At least that's the that's what the explanation is. Yeah. But then again, it could be that it's just a word. That could be one way of understanding it. But
So what does rub mean? If
what?
you go with what David suggests, what does rub mean?
What does rov mean?
Rub. I mean,
Rub.
Keruv means like a rub. So what's a rub?
So seemingly, like Ravya would be a child. So ruv would be from the word Ravya. I mean, the other way of learning is that Kuruv is just the Gemara is explaining what. Let me just. Sorry. So the other way of understanding is maybe not. Kaf is not like, and it just means Kuruv. What does Kuruv mean? It's Kuravya. It means like a child. In other words, the word Kuruv, the Chaf is part of the word, and that word means like a child. So that's another way of learning. But seemingly what you're saying is correct. Anyway, yeah, the commentaries do talk a little about the word kruv. But anyway,
we're trying to figure out is the source the source a resh vase or is the source chuf resh vase?
Right. I hear you. It sounds from Rabbi Avahu that it's kiravya, like a child. That's what it sounds like. That it's as you know, it sounds like you're saying that it's like kiravya would mean like a ravya. Okay. Anyway, so the Gemara proved either from the fact that the maskeras was a tefach. We learned from the maskeras that it's the size of that the kapiris is a tefach, is a handbreadth. Or we learned from the pnei that it's we learned from the fact that the cherub is a handbreadth, and that would mean that the kapiris was also, it says the word pnei would also be a tefach, a handbreadth. So the Gemara now says that the size of a sukkah is 10 handbreadths. Now, when we talk about the size of the ark, we included the ark and the cover. Altogether was 10 handbreadths. And the understanding is that by a sukkah, there has to be 10 handbreadths of hollow. That would be seemingly the understanding of a sukkah, that a sukkah needs, you need 10 handbreadths of hollow. The problem is that if you're learning from the ark that a sukkah needs to be 10 handbreadths, it would seem that could include the schach and have less than 10 handbreadths as hollow, and that would be a kosher sukkah. So that's what the Gemara asks over here.
I'm sorry, what was the last thing you just said, Rebbe?
That if we're going to learn, like we've just proved, that the ark is 10 handbreadths, and that's why a sukkah should be 10 handbreadths, we have a problem. The sukkah being 10 handbreadths, the halacha about that from the first Mishnah is that the hollow should be 10 handbreadths. But if you learn a sukkah needs to be 10 handbreadths from the ark, that would seemingly include the schach as well, as part of those 10 handbreadths could include the roof. So is it the hollow that needs to be 10 handbreadths or the roof? If the roof is part of the 10 handbreadths, fine, then you could learn from the ark that the ark is 10 handbreadths. So a sukkah, including the roof, the sukkah, the schach, that's all together is 10 handbreadths. But if you hold that the hollow is 10 handbreadths, so that means that a sukkah really is bigger than 10 handbreadths. So then that would mean that the sukkah, maybe you can't learn from the ark because the ark really includes the schach. So the Gemara now says, "Mimai dechalala asara bar mischacha." So how do you know that the hollow itself needs to be 10 handbreadths besides for the schach? Ema, let's say that bahade schacha together with the schach altogether is 10 handbreadths, just like the ark together with the kapiras, together with the cover of the ark was 10 handbreadths altogether. So here also we should say that the schach together with the sukkah, the hollow, all together should be, and that should be kosher. And of course, the Gemara understands that can't be, because we need a hollow of 10 handbreadths. So the Gemara says, Ella, rather, we need to find another source. So the Gemara says, Ella mi beis lamim gama. We're going to have to learn it from the Beis Hamikdash. And the Beis Hamikdash is called Beis Olamim. It's after the Beis Hamikdash, there was no heter there was no permit to build any bamais, any altars, and therefore it's called the Beis Olamim. At least according to some, that's the reason why it's called Beis Olamim. But it's the Beis Hamikdash we're going to learn from the Chsiv, as it says by the Beis Hamikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built, that B'habayis asher bana HaMelech Shlomo LaHashem Shisha Mama Arka. The house that Shlomo built for Hashem was 60 amos length, 60 cubits. The Esrim Rachbay, 20 cubits was the width. Ushloisha Mama Kaimasai, and 30 amos, 30 cubits was the height. Uksiv, and it says, Kaimas HaKruv HaEchad. So now when we talk about the cherub in the Beis Hamikdash, it says, Kaimas HaKruv HaEchad Eser Biyama, the Kruv, the cherub, one of them was 10 amos, V'chein HaKruv HaSheni, and the second one as well was 10 amos. So what does that mean? If they were the cherubs in the Beis Hamikdash were placed on the floor, and this is the second set of cherubs which we learned about in the Book of Kings, and they would be standing on the floor, and they reached up to 10 amos, 10 cubits, which means a third of the room. The Holy of Holies was 30 cubits. and a third of that was 10 cubits, and that's how big the cherubs were. But Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Mamotzinu, just like we find the Beis Elamim in the Beis Hamikdash, proven b'shlish habayis hinoimdim, that the cherubs took up a third of the room of the Beis of the height of the Beis Hamikdash. Mishkan, in the Mishkan also, Mishkan Nami, proven b'shlish habayis hinoimdim. The cherubs took up a third of the height of the Mishkan. Now, Mishkan Kamahavi, so how big was the Mishkan? Eser Amos. The Mishkan was 10 Amos high. How do we know that? Because how big were the boards of the Mishkan? The boards of the Mishkan were called the Krushim. And it says Eser Amos. Eser Amos. That's how big the Mishkan was, 10 Amos. The Chsiv, as it says, Eser Amos Eirech HaParash. Every beam was 10 Amos tall. The way the Mishkan was built is not like a house. It was built with the wooden boards vertical. And when you build houses, they build it horizontal when they build houses out of wood. But the Mishkan was the temporary tabernacle. Now, in the desert, so the way it was built was the wood was standing up in a vertical way. And so each board was 10 amos, 10 cubits tall. That means that was the height of the Mishkan. So kama habilahu, how much would be the height altogether? Shisin pushchi, that would be 60 handbreadths. And pushchi is Aramaic for tefach. So altogether, that would be 60 tefachim. Tilsa kamahavi, how much is a third of that? Esrim pushchi is 20 handbreadths. So a third of and it was just like the cherubs in the Beis Hamikdash took up a third of the height. So in the Mishkan, and the tabernacle was also a third of the height, and it was 20 handbreadths. Dal, take away Asara, the Aron v'Kapiris, take away 10 handbreadths for the ark in the Kapiris and the board on top. Pashu lahu Asara. You're left with 10 handbreadths left. So it comes out that the size of the cherubs in the Mishkan and the tabernacle from their feet to their head was 10 handbreadths. Uksiv, and it says, V'hayu hakruvim, and the kruvim were parsei chnafayim, spread out wings, lamaila above, soichechem, think about the word soichechem, schach, it was the schach, soichechem, covering, shading over, bekanfeim with their wings, al hakapiris, over the kapiris, over the board that was the cover of the ark. So, so the Torah says that the word schach, when something covers over 10 handbreadths of hollow. And so we know that the cherubs were 10 handbreadths, and the kruvim, they had their wings spread out above, and so and basically covered over the kapiris. And we just figured out that there's 10 handbreadths of space because that's how big the cherubs were. So from here we see that schach is used for something that covers over 10 empty handbreadths. That would make sense to be a sukkah being a size of 10 handbreadths of hollow. Umimai de gadfinu ilave reishayu taimi. And how do you know that the cherub's wings were spread out above the head of the of the cherubs. Dilma lahade reshayu kaimi. Maybe the wings were equal to their heads, and it would come out that the 10 handbreadths is not hollow handbreadths. It's including the covering as well, similar to the problem we just had when we're learning from the ark. We'll have the same problem again if we learn from the cherubs, because if it covers over a space and altogether it's 10 handbreadths, including the wings as well, then it would mean that we don't have a 10 handbreadths of hollow. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, l'mayluksiv. It says they were above, and the understanding is it was above the heads of the cherub, and therefore it would basically mean that it was 10 handbreadths of hollow, because that's how big the size of the cherubs were. And right above that you have the wings, and so the wings are called schach, like a sukkah. Above the sukkah has 10 handbreadths of hollow. The Gemara says maybe it's much more. If it says it was higher, the wings maybe were much higher than the head of the cherubs. The cherubs were 10 handbreadths of hollow, but maybe the wings were even more than that, and it would mean that a sukkah needs more than 10 handbreadths of hollow. Maybe it's even much bigger than that. The Gemara answers, Mi ksiv lamaila. Does it say above the above? It just says, in other words, very high above. It just says it's right above the heads. The wings were right above the head, and therefore it would mean that there's 10 handbreadths of hollow, and that would mean that a sukkah is kosher with 10 handbreadths of hollow. So instead of learning from the ark, we're learning from the cherubs above the ark. What this boils down to from I guess from a Kabbalistic perspective, is that the sukkah, what comes out here is that the sukkah is a very spiritual location, and there is, and seemingly that's why the Gemara is learning from the ark, from the cherubs, because the sukkah is this great spiritual revelation of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. And when you're in the sukkah, we know that there's very great, it's considered the sukkah, it really combines two elements. On the one hand, you do everything that you however you would live, you do in the sukkah. And on the other hand, it's considered like the great clouds of glory. And it's, as we see in our Gemara, it's very connected to to where Hashem's Shekhinah rested, that it's right between the Kruvim, above the Kapiras, that's where the Shekhinah was. So that means that there's a special light that's in the sukkah. As we know, it's in Hasidic writings, it's the Ar Makif. There's a light that surrounds, that can't internalize even. It's a very high light that's be above internalizing, and that's in the sukkah. So seemingly it fits with our Gemara very well, that idea, because the Gemara specifically is learning the laws of sukkah from the Beis Hamikdash, and from the holiest, the holy of holies. Okay, Zai gesund, everyone.
Rabbi,
Yes. Yes.
There's a picture here. I'm wondering if I can share it, because it looks like there's two sets of the keruvim. There's the keruvim above the Aaron, and the keruvim that are standing on the ground.
That's what I mentioned by the Beis Hamikdash. Yeah.
Right.
So can I share this picture? You
sure,
can tell me if
sure.
it's
Yeah,
okay.
definitely.
Hold on, let me see. Okay, share. We'll do screen. Okay.
Yeah. Very nice. Yep. It's not so clear, but I guess that's the best we're gonna get. Thank you for showing it. So in other words, the the ones standing on the ground were 20 cubits tall, and the ceiling is supposed to be 60 cubits. And that
And
was
you
in
can
the
see
base
all-
of Migdash. Yeah.
And you can see all the way to the right is the Kohen.
You see, the Kohen is the
Yeah.
right, and in the middle is the other cherubs that are on top of the ark that was with the
But
papyrus.
the Kohen should never be in the same room as the Aron.
How did they take a picture of that on Yom Kippur? That's the question.
Right, that's what I'm saying. The Kohen, it can only be the Kohen Gadol, and that doesn't look like his hat either, or a Chayshin, or it doesn't look like the 8 begodim.
Well, anyway, it's not a picture; it's a painting.
I
But
didn't even
Yeah,
know they had.
Oh,
But the
I didn't even
Kohen,
know. I
the
didn't even know
Kohen
they
did
had
not-
an old
cameras.
Kodak.
the
I didn't
Kohen
even know
did
they
not.
had cameras in those days.
Anyway,
But the
very
Kohen-
good.
Very important. The Kohen did not wear his begodim all into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. He only wore white.
Oh,
Before-
that's right. That's
Only
right.
four begodim.
So is this smoke that's coming up in the middle? Is that like the incense or?
Yes, that's the brazier. He brings in the brazier when he goes in.
Mm.
He has to put the Ketores on top of the brazier when he comes in. So there'll be smoke covering over the ark.
Mm.
It's all in the Yom Kippur description in Chrimos.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you, David. Okay, sei
You're welcome.
gesund. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Peace.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.